Okay, we are live.
We're all good to go? Good
All
afternoon.
good.
Hi, good afternoon and welcome to this Canmore Local Assessment Review Board hearing. We're here today to review the complaint and subsequent evidence as filed for tax roll number 18455. This is a legal description condo plan 04-11156 unit 56. So I'll start by introducing the panel and then ask the parties to introduce themselves. After that, I will explain our standard hearing procedure and ask for any comments. So my name is Dale Hildebrand and I'm the presiding chair appointed to this panel. The other panel members with me today here are Andrea Williams, and Sean Kraseret. Did I get that correct, Sean?
Yeah, very close. Sean Krausert. Yes.
Kraseret, great. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any objections to the panelists constituted? Todd?
I don't.
Lance?
No, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'm now going to have the parties introduce themselves, starting with the complainant. Would you please state for the record your name, organization, and your role in this hearing? Please indicate whether you're the owner of this property under complaint.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your time today. My name is Todd Stokowski. I'm acting as an agent for the owners of the property.
And are the owners on participating in the hearing today?
They are not.
Thank you. And now to the respondent's representative, would you please state for the name your record your name, organization, and your position with the municipality?
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lance Wayloggy. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. I'm the appointed assessor for the town of Canmore. I'm with Benchmark Assessment Consultants, and I will be the respondent on behalf of the town here today.
Thank you, Lance. So our standard practice is to first have the complainant present all of their evidence, followed by questions from the respondent and then the panel. Next, the respondent presents their evidence, followed by questions from the complainant and then the panel. The complainant will have an opportunity for rebuttal. And then finally, both parties will have an opportunity to present their final argument and summarize their evidence for the panel, with the complainant presenting first. If anyone needs a problem, or if anyone needs a break or a problem comes up, please let me know. Or given our world here in Zoom, please feel free to call one of the clerks. Are there any questions regarding the procedure today? And is everyone satisfied with this process as I've laid out?
Yes.
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Are there any preliminary issues that you'd like the panel to address before we start?
Not from my perspective.
Great, thank you very much. So both parties have exchanged evidence in this before the hearing. I propose that we mark all these documents for the record now. It won't stop anyone from raising questions about admissibility later. If any such questions arise, we will deal with them and strike material from the record later if necessary. Is everyone comfortable with this procedure?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Thank you, Todd. Okay, so we have 4 packages of evidence from the complainant. Complainant evidence package 1, September 25th, which we'll mark as C1. Complainant evidence package number 2, October 22nd, which we will mark as C2. We have complainant rebuttal package November 6th, we will mark as C3. And we have complainant supplemental submission package November 9th, which we will mark as C4. And finally, we have the respondent's evidence, which we will mark as R1. Does anyone have any issues with the evidence that we've marked? All right, Mr. Stokowski, we're ready to hear your evidence. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Again, the appeal relates to the assessed value of the property. I will be presenting evidence to illustrate that the assessed value of the property does not reflect the market value of the property. And that'll be a repeating theme today of market value, market value, market value. So the market value and that the assessment should be lowered to reflect market value. There's three main arguments I'm going to present to why $1,360,000 is the correct value or the correct market value of the subject property. The three main arguments are going to be that market transactions provide the best indicator of market value, that the assessed value of the property is an outlier in comparison to similar units in the same complex in relation to the sale price to assessment ratio, or as the respondents uses ASR, which is the assessment to the sale price ratio. And my third main argument is that I assert that the respondent has not provided any third-party evidence to support the assessed value in this appeal. Going on to my first argument, the first argument I'm presenting is that market value is determined by, or back up a bit, market value is the best determinator of assessed value. Market value is determined by a willing buyer and a willing seller. And so I'm going to suggest of what method is better to determine market value of the subject property. Is it the value determined by the respondent or the alternate value that I'm proposing? And I submit that it's the alternate value that I'm proposing. Using comparable sales data is good and standard acceptable practice for a theoretical determination of market value, but is not as good as the actual sale of the exact property that's subject to this appeal. When determining the assessed value of the subject property, the respondent failed to recognize and give effect to the transaction involving the subject property that took place right around July 1st, 2019. I refer to the Government of Alberta's written document titled Filing a Property Assessment Complaint and Preparing for Your Hearing. I believe that's page 35 of C2 of the evidence. I refer specifically to the fourth paragraph from the bottom of the page, and it states that residential properties are assessed on the basis of a property's market value. The next paragraph states that market value is defined as, quote, the price a property might reasonably sell for after adequate time and exposure to an open market when sold by a willing seller to a willing buyer. The Municipal Government Acts defines market value as the amount that a property as defined in section 284(1)(r) might be expected to realize if it is sold on the open market by a willing seller and willing buyer. So when I break down the definition of market buyer or market value, the facts show that market value, and by definition, the assessed value of the subject property should be $1,360,000. The evidence that has been provided and the facts that are relevant to the situation prove that the subject property was listed for adequate time. The subject property was listed on the open market. The seller was a willing seller and the buyer was a willing buyer. I refer to the seller's letter. So that's page 3 of C2. Just flip into it as we go as well. If anybody ever wants me to slow down or to have a question throughout this, just let me know. So, and also on page 4 of C2 is the listing history. Both of those pieces of evidence prove that the property was listed for ample time to determine the market value. The seller attempted to sell the property at higher list prices, and after time needed to adjust the price to come down to market value. The seller was willing to sell the property, but was not under any specific pressure to sell for anything less than market value. So that's proven again on page 3 of C2, the letter from the seller. The property was listed on the MLS real estate system so it was subject to an open market. That's on page 4 of C2, the evidence. As you can tell, the property was listed for a long time. It started at a list price of $1,795,000. It kept going down, 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 and down to determine market value. So the seller, again, he wanted to maximize his price, but he realized the market wouldn't pay what he wanted, so he had to reduce the price. As set out in the letter from the buyers of the subject unit on page 1 of C2, with the assistance of a realtor and looking at other properties in Canmore before acquiring the subject property, the current owners of the subject unit were able to determine market value of the subject property and reached a deal with the seller. And I think it's important to note that the owners of the subject property, it's not their first time to the Canmore market. They own another property in Canmore. And so it's not like they were uninformed buyers. I also want to refer to the words and references to other court cases in Justin Acton's decision in paragraphs 24 and 25 on page 7 of C4. Her comment supports my assertion that market value is best determined by what happens in fact, rather than in a hypothetical situation. She goes on to say—
Sorry, Todd, can you
Yes.
just help us out? Where on page 7 of C4 are you?
Oh, thank you for asking. Paragraph 24,
Thank you.
5.
Please proceed.
Yeah, thank you. She goes on to say, I also agree that where, in this case, there is sufficient evidence of actual market value, there is no need to engage all the factors set out in section 12 of the regulation. She also agrees with the reasoning of Justice Fraser that, and I quote, that where there is a conflict between the actual market value and the factors set out in section 12, the market value as defined by the act should govern. Not to belabor this point any further, but Justice Acton's comments at the end of paragraph 24, they really resonate with me. So it's right at the very end. And this is the one that most hits home with me. The quote is, I think that generally speaking, the recent sale price, if available as it was in this case, is in law and in common sense, the most realistic and most reliable method of establishing market value. I assert that the respondent, for whatever reason, chose to ignore market evidence that applied good common sense in determining the assessed value. My second argument is to present the variance between the sales price and the assessed value. The subject property is an outlier as compared to some other units in the same complex in this regard and using the standard. So although the mass appraisal approach is not intended to determine the value of a specific unit, in the case of the subject property, the use of the mass appraisal approach resulted in an assessment that is much higher than the other units' assessments in the same complex, with the highest closest assessment in the complex being $1,572,000, which is $184,000 less than the subject property's assessment. So if you go to pages 32, 33, and 34 of C2, just going to go there now. That is a listing of all the assessed properties in the complex. The complex is broken down in terms of 140 Stone Creek Road and 150 Stone Creek Road. There were 2 phases. It's the same complex. So for example, Unit 304, which is pages 28 and 29 of C2. You'll see that Unit 304 was purchased less than a year before the subject property for $1,365,000, which is very similar to the sale price of the subject property. And they're both considered penthouse properties. But the 2020 assessed value of Unit 304, 140 Stone Creek Road, is $532,000 lower than the subject property's 2020 assessed value. So I want to just repeat that even though the sale price of both the subject property and Unit 304, 140 Stone Creek Road are within $15,000 of each other. The assessed value of the subject property is $532,000 more. In all fairness, I want to point out that Unit 304, 140 Stone Creek Road is a smaller unit than the subject unit, which could be argued that the assessment should be lower, but I referred back to what the market determined to be both the value of both properties. The market value both determined around $1,360,000. And the fact that size in itself isn't the only factor in determining market value. Unit 303, 150 Stone Creek Road, which is pages 28 and 30 of C2, is another example of a discrepancy in the assessed value of the subject property. Unit 303, 150 Stone Creek Road, again, this is in the same complex. This property was purchased in May of 2019 for $1,663,000, which is $283,000 more than the purchase price of the subject unit. But the assessed value of 303, 150 Stone Creek Road is $184,000 less than the subject property's assessed value. That one I'm having a real hard time kind of wrapping my head around it. Going back to page 28 of C, when looking at a comparison between the purchase price of some comparable units in the same complex and the assessed values of those units, most are in proximity of either the sale price or the adjusted July 1st, 2019 sales price, but the subject property is substantially different. The average percentage of assessed value as compared to the July 1st, 2019 adjusted sale price is 93%. The percentage of the assessed value as compared to the sale price of the subject unit is 127%. To me, that variance is not substantiated. I guess it isn't substantiated in my mind. It's unsubstantiated that it doesn't make sense, but it makes sense to me because the assessed value is too high. If we had the assessed value lower, we would see the ratio to be right around 100%. My third argument is that I assert the respondent has not provided any evidence to support the assessed value. As stated in Justice Youngworth's 2015 decision, which is on page 34 of C4, paragraph 65. So I'm just going down to it. Page 38. Justice Youngworth goes on to say that the statistical model used for mass market appraisal is not evidence supporting the municipality's calculation of market value.
Sorry, Todd, you lost me again.
All right, that's fine. Page 65, or paragraph 65.
65, yeah.
On page 38 of C4.
Okay, sorry for interrupting.
I'm glad you did. Good to go?
Thank you.
So paragraph 2 is what I was talking about, where this says the statistical model used for mass market appraisal is not evidence supporting the municipality's calculation of market value. And in the preceding paragraph, Justice Youngworth states, and I'm paraphrasing, that the evidentiary burden shifts to the municipality to provide evidence supporting its assessment of market value after the complainant provides prima facie, in other words, layman's terms or one's first impressions or logical thoughts about evidence. And I assert that this test that I have provided prima facie evidence that evidence has been met by way of the subject unit selling right around July 1st, 2019. So market evidence has shown purchase price and market value, $1,360,000. I keep saying $1,360,000 even though the sale price was $1,380,000, I subtracted 10 grand off for each of the 2 parking stalls that were included in the purchase price. Where I got $10,000 was that's off the assessed value of those parking stall units. So if the assessed value is $10,000 per unit, I'm saying the purchase price was $1,380,000. Probably need to subtract $20,000 off of that purchase price to account for the value of the parking stalls. So if we go to page 37 of C4, paragraph 59, Justice Youngworth's opinion that statistical models used to prepare the mass assessments cannot be used to defend an assessment. The models were used to prepare the assessment, so it's unreasonable to rely upon it to support of essentially its own calculation. So using that relevant to today, this can be extended by the respondent explaining his methods of determining the assessment isn't evidence, and it's an explanation of how the assessment was determined, but it's not evidence supporting the assessment. And that concludes my initial presentation.
Thank you very much. Any respondent questions, Lance?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Am I saying it right, Mr. Stokowski? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, you got it right.
Okay. We've been exchanging pleasantries for so long. I known you as Todd, so I'll refer to you as Mr. Stokowski for the hearing. No, I think for the most part, Mr. Chairman, we've had good communication for the last 6 or 7 months, and I know where Mr. Stokowski stands, and I know largely all of his evidence is very clear and concise. So I don't have any questions for clarification at this time. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'll now move on to board questions. Andrea, would you like to go first?
Sure. I just have one question in relation to the parking stalls. You noted that you took $20,000 off with a couple of parking stalls. With the evidence, the market evidence that you've provided in support of your value, did you do the same? Did you look at the parking stalls also for those units?
Can you clarify your question? I'm missing the question.
Okay, so you came up with a value for your unit and you took off $10,000 per parking stall for 2 parking stalls. And you've also come up with some evidence of similar properties. Did you also do the same analysis for those properties just in relation to the parking stalls?
No, I took those, so to answer your question today, if I said comparable property was purchased for X amount of dollars, did I subtract $20,000 off?
Yeah.
No.
Okay. I'm just wondering if it factored into your analysis at all.
Yeah, good
That's the
question.
question. Thanks. That's all I had for the moment. Thank you.
Oh,
No questions, Mr. Chair.
thank you. I was wondering if I could get you to go to page 4 of C2, which was this listings found by this address. I just wanted to clarify what I understood your evidence to be. So going back as far as 2012, this property was listed initially at 1.795 million. So through the passage of time here, was this always the same seller?
Yes.
Okay. And obviously there's some gaps here, right? They had it for sale for a while and looked like it expired, but more particularly on the third sort of set there, it was on for 1.795 in 2014. for 286 days. So that would have taken it somewhere into mid 2015 or Q3 of 15. And then it was off the market for maybe 2 years before it came back on. Am I reading that right?
That's the way I read it as well.
Okay. And then, so it was on the market into 2019 until so there was a price reduction there, I assume, at some point. Do you know if that's
2018.
right? Okay. And then sold, and the date unconditional is the date that then the parties waive all conditions and they have a firm deal. So your evidence then is that's a very good indication of what market value would be on July 1st of 2019?
Correct.
Okay. I also noticed that the square footage has changed in the second last column through these listings, but I guess you have confirmed for me that it is in fact the same unit and nothing materially has changed other than perhaps the measurement standard.
I've never noticed that, so good point. It is the same unit, and I don't know which is the correct, how's that for English? Correct square footage, 3,402 or 3,178.
Okay.
That's interesting. The unit must have went on a diet and it got smaller.
I think the common phrase is measure twice, get 3 different answers. So.
Yeah, with all due respect to my good friends, Anne and Rob, I suspect that the measurement standard has evolved in the last while, and that might be the case there, but thank you for clarifying that for me. Okay, then, I think those are the board's questions. We'll now move on to the respondents' evidence.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me know when you're ready.
Fire when ready, sir.
Okay. Well, I think I've had the opportunity to present in front of all of the members here in previous hearings, but I usually take the opportunity to introduce myself to everybody, and since it's the first time that me and Mr. Stikowski have been on Zoom together, I'll go ahead and introduce myself one more time. My name is Lance Wayloggy. I'm an accredited municipal assessor of Alberta. I've been an assessor for roughly 16 years, preparing assessments in various municipalities in Alberta, including Lethbridge, 40 Mile, Foremost, Bow Island, Redcliffe, Nanton, and of course, Canmore. I've prepared assessments for a variety of properties, multifamily properties, non-residential properties, golf courses, shopping malls, hotels, etc. Just before I get into my presentation, I tend to jump around a little bit, similar as the complainant has done. So I will reference page numbers and paragraph numbers as I go through. I understand that you guys have seen the documents prior to the hearing, so we'll try to focus on the main points and go from there. So with that said, Mr. Chairman, if we could move to my page 5. Page 5, I think we're all in agreement on the issue here. It is a market value issue. Of course, the question for the board is very simple, very straightforward. Is the assessed value of $1,756,000 reasonable, or is the alternative value that has been proposed by the complainant at $1,360,000 more reasonable? So just to give you an outline of my presentation is going to focus on 3 areas. The first being a little bit of background as to the preparation of residential assessments in the town of Canmore. Then we'll move into the evidence and analysis package, or part of the package. And then lastly, very quickly, I'll reference a few board decisions in conclusion. So if we could go to start off on my page 4, I did notice between the hearing this morning and this hearing here today, there was a typo in the previous hearing. And I thought I might just mention that right now as I go forward, because you're going to hear one number that's pretty similar to the previous hearing. And that's because it was a typo in the previous hearing. So when I get there, I'll let you know And hopefully we can pass that on to the previous chair so she knows. But I'll start in on paragraph 4.1. So just to give you a little bit of background of the preparation of residential condominiums. So in the town of Canmore, and actually in all municipalities in Alberta, the assessor is required to use 3 years of sales to prepare the assessments for residential condominiums. So this 3-year data set is prior to the valuation date. So for the current 2020 tax year, all sales from July 1st, 2016 to June 30th, 2019 were used to prepare the value for residential condominiums. All of those sales were used to develop time adjustment factors, which I'll speak on a little later in the presentation. But I did want to make a comment a direct comment to the complainant's assertion that the assessor essentially ignored a sale that happened after the valuation date. I wouldn't say ignored those. Ultimately, the assessor cannot use sales after the valuation date. When we prepare assessments and we submit them to municipal affairs for audit and for the development of assessment levels to be used in the equalized assessment, essentially the assessor is cut off from using any sales after that valuation date. And of course, when we're audited for residential condominiums specifically, we are required to use 3 years of sales. So this isn't just a town of Canmore assessment policy or benchmarks policy. This is province-wide. It's standardized for a reason. And again, these assessments are established or submitted to the province to establish assessment levels to be used in the equalized assessment for the remittance of provincial education tax. So it is a standardized procedure throughout Alberta, and that's why the sale of the subject property is not included in the documents here today and was not considered in the preparation of the 2020 tax year assessment. Because it transferred after the valuation date, it will be included in next year's assessment, but unfortunately, it didn't meet the cutoff for the 2020 tax year assessment. If I could turn your direction to page 7. So as I previously mentioned, when the assessor is required to use 3 years of property sales, market conditions over that time, depending on the municipality, can increase, they can decrease over time. It's very rare that you see periods or 3-year periods of very static change. Usually the market is changing over a period of time. So the assessor is required when using 3 years of sales to adjust every sale occurring within that period to the valuation date of July 1st, 2016. So what we do to analyze and apply those adjustments is we use a sale to assessment ratio analysis. Essentially, we're taking the sales and we develop a ratio based on the previous year's assessment, and we trend that over time to determine what the market has done over the analysis period. Essentially, what you're doing is you're extracting times effect on value over that time period. For residential condominiums, 984 residential condominium sales were used. If you remember in the previous hearing, I also said 984. Unfortunately, that number should have been 374. So 984 is for residential condos. 374 was for the previous lodging condos. So just a note on the previous hearing there. Ultimately, the trend for residential condominiums over that period did show significant increases in market value, and time adjustment factors were developed and applied accordingly to the entire portfolio. So on page 8, you'll see based on the month that the property sold, there's a time adjustment factor to bring that sale price to July 1st, 2019. It is important to note that in this particular hearing, with the evidence presented and specifically in my package, the time adjustment factors are not as big a deal as in maybe previous hearings. You'll notice once we get to the evidence and argument section, the sales evidence that I've included were actually within, I think, 10-ish months of the valuation date, so required very little time adjustment. So I can see the complainant's assertion that the assessor isn't providing evidence or has not provided evidence. And I suspect he's probably talking about the time adjustment here, but either way, whether you analyze the sales without the time adjustment or with the time adjustment, you're gonna find that it's gonna produce this very similar results, ultimately because the sales were relatively close to the valuation date. Moving on to page 9, evidence and analysis. For residential condominiums, because there's such a large amount of property sales, we do favor to the direct sales comparison approach. So with residential condominiums, it's very important to stay within the residential condominium itself. So typically how we develop our valuation models is we look at the sales within a residential condominium, and we use exclusively the sales that occur within those residential condominiums to build a valuation model. So the reason being is that residential condo complexes are highly similar. All the units in the complexes are highly similar. They reflect similar locations, similar age, similar quality, similar replacement schedules, similar parking, similar amenities. So very homogeneous property types. And that's why we typically favor developing assessment models just using the sales within the subject complex. And that's for every residential complex in the town of Canmore. Because the properties are so homogeneous, the direct comparison approach, what you typically do is you would go through the sales and you would adjust for differences to the subject property. But because they're so homogeneous, essentially we can demonstrate to the board that the assessment is reasonable by just doing a simple price per square foot analysis. And so that's what we'll do here on page 10. And if we go to paragraph 5.5, we start out by introducing the only 3 comparable sales that occurred or in between July 1st, 2016 to June 30th, 2019. So over that 3-year period in the subjects complex, so that's both 140 and 150, there was only three sales. So of course, using mass appraisal, what we do is we use all 3 of those sales, and the assessor is legislated to prepare assessments using mass appraisal. So we're stratifying similar property. We're using all of the common data within the stratifications. That is the subjects or the comparable sales within the complex. And then we're creating a valuation model to apply back to that portfolio. The intent is to create a valuation model which reflects the typical. So that's why when you look at a sale price and an assessment, that's why you don't see the assessment equaling sales price all the time. It's because for similar property, you're going to have a range of sale prices, and the intent for the assessor is to take those sales within the stratification of similar property and build a valuation model which reflects the typical market conditions. So it's not an acceptable procedure specifically to ensure equity to just take the sale price of every property that's sold and then set the assessment to sale price. You will not see that in the town of Canmore, and you will not see that hopefully in any other jurisdictions in Alberta. So on my paragraph 5.5, these are the 3 sales that sold over that time period. So to note, 2 of these sales were on the 3rd floor. So that's unit 303 and 304. And the 3rd sale was on the 2nd floor. So that's unit 204. But before we start our analysis, as I mentioned, we do apply the time adjustment factor to adjust all the sales to the valuation date. As you can see here, to my previous point, the time adjustment factors are very little in this case because the sales occurred very close to the valuation date. So they required very little adjustment at all. Whether you analyze these without the adjustment or with the adjustment, ultimately it's going to lead to the same conclusion, in my opinion. But here are the time adjusted sale prices for each of the 3 sales. Scrolling down on page 10, you'll see at the bottom there, this is just to highlight where the subject property is in comparison to the subject sales that I've introduced above. So if you see here on the third floor, bottom of page 10, this is the subject property, legally described as Unit 56. Scrolling to the next page, you see comparable number 1 and comparable number 2. So these are also sales on the third floor of the complex. This is a 150 Stone Creek Road, so it's essentially the next building over. It is important to note that comparable number 1, if you look at the unit layout and the location of unit 1, it's virtually it's highly similar. The unit layout's very similar. It's just a bit small. It's a bit on the smaller side versus the subject property, but very similar to the subject. Comparable number 2 is the unit directly south. And lastly, on page 12, comparable number 3 is on the second floor. So essentially, Mr. Chairman and members of the board, we have 3 sales within the subject property. 2 are located on the third floor of the subject property. The third is located on the second floor, but all properties are very similar. If we turn to paragraph 5.6, you can see that these 3 properties represent the most comparable properties within the 3-year period to develop the valuation model for not only the subject property, but for all units in the subject complex. So if we take a look at the sale price, the time adjusted sale price per square foot of these 3 sales, you'll see that the sale prices per square foot do range from $473 a square foot up to $603, with an average of $545 a square foot and a median of $558. Compared to the subject's assessment at $516 a square foot, it would suggest that the market sales over that period were slightly higher than what the subject is assessed at. And that's evidenced even within the complainant's presentation when he was looking at a percentage of assessment to sale price. Using these 3 sales, he came up with 93%. If you scroll to the bottom of my page, you'll see that I come up with 0.95%, or sorry, 0.95 as a median ratio. So ultimately, these sales would suggest that the market value of similar properties would be a little bit higher than the current assessment. And I'll stop right there too, because I just want to directly respond to the complainant's assertion that I haven't introduced any market evidence to support the assessment. These 3 sales are market evidence. These are the market indicators. And in fact, I can understand that the complainant may not be relying on these specifically, as he's putting, it seems, all the weight on the sale of the subject property post facto. But these are the market comparables that were available over the time period and were used to develop the assessment model. So there's nothing within this evidence or within these sales indicators that would suggest that this isn't market evidence, or this isn't good evidence to establish the market value of the complainant's properties, as well as similar properties in the subject complex. On page 5.7, this is essentially what the assessment level or the quality of assessment. So after an assessor creates a valuation model, one of the steps in mass appraisal is statistical testing. So what we would do is we would look at how the assessed values compared to the time adjusted sale prices to give us an indication of the quality of the assessment model. And what you're looking at is just an extension of what I've been saying, is that if you take the assessment divided by the sales, the ratios, the median ratio of the 3 indicators would come in at 0.951, which would suggest, again, the assessments are slightly on the low side based on all of the comparable sales within that analysis period. On my page 14, this is paragraph 5.8. I do this for I know equity isn't really an issue at today's hearing, but it is important to note that the reason why mass appraisal is legislated, why the assessor legislatively has to create a mass appraisal model to reflect a typical market condition is because of equity. If the assessor just set, yes?
Lance, sorry, it's me. I just need to.
Oh, you're muted, Dale.
Sorry, that's okay. Please, sorry to interrupt. Please proceed.
No problem. No problem. So the key point that I was trying to make here under 5.8 is that it's the reason why we create valuation models to reflect typical market conditions, the reason why it's legislated to do so, the reason why the assessor has to use mass appraisal is purely because of equity. We want to make sure that similar units are assessed similarly because at the end of the day, yes, they are used, the values are used to levy property taxation. So if we set all of the sales or all of the properties that's sold, if we set their assessments equal to sale price, ultimately what you're going to have is a very extreme case of inequity. And that's essentially why it's legislated for the assessor to use mass appraisal. It's legislated to prepare valuation models to reflect the typical market conditions, is so that equity is ensured. So on page 5.8, excuse me. On page 5.8, this is just the introduction of all of the third floor assessments of all of the other similar units within the complex. This is just to show that overall, yes, there's a bit of variance, but overall, the assessments of similar units on the third floor are pretty close to the assessment of the subject property at $516 a square foot. Moving to my paragraph 5.9, so there was an appraisal that was submitted in the disclosure evidence of the complainant. You know, I won't spend a lot of time on it because I know Mr. Stakowski didn't spend a lot of time on it, but there is a little bit of information disclosed in both around the appraisal. I know Mr. Stakowski's mostly putting all or most of his weight on the sale price of the subject property as the most important evidence before the board. But ultimately, I just wanted to make a few comments about the appraisal, and no disrespect to the appraiser. I know she does good work. This is just a case of where two professionals disagree a little bit, and so I've respectfully outlined a few of my comments with respect to the selection of some comparables, and I've started that off on paragraph 5.9. So in short, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, basically the appraiser had used one of the three comparables within the subject complex that it sold. So out of the three comparables that I introduced, the appraiser used one, but ultimately chose to go 6 kilometers away to the Three Sisters area to select a comparable that was a multi-story unit, where the ground level was the garage, the second level was the main floor, and then the third level was the upper level. The third comparable, the appraiser chose to go into the downtown core and select a property that was it's essentially not complete as of the valuation date, as of the physical condition date, and actually as of the current date. I believe the completion date for the third comparable is in 2021. So I'm just highlighting a few of those differences and why I think the comparables that we have chosen to develop the assessment model, which are the three comparables within the subjects complex, reflect essentially the best market evidence available, rather than going outside of the complex into the Three Sisters area, which is 6 kilometers away, or the downtown core, which is roughly 2 kilometers away. So I have outlined some of those differences in my disclosure, and I won't go into too much detail of those. But ultimately, it just comes down to the selection of comparables. And as I mentioned, I think that, or in my opinion, the comparable sales in the subjects complex are the best indicators of value. And of course, that's how the assessment was prepared for the subject complex. With that said, Mr. Chairman, I do want to conclude on a few points of argument on page 21. This is my argument, and I'd like to introduce under 6.2. This is the beta management case, a very important case for not only the assessors but for boards as well. One important piece to note that this is a 2017 decision, and I know that the complainant has disclosed some contradictory evidence in court decisions, but it's important to know that those decisions were from 2005 and 2015. This is the most recent Court of Queen's bench decision on the issue of post facto information that I know about. And ultimately, if I could just read word for word, because it's so very important, in the middle of page 21 on my point 6.2, the judge speaks to post facto information where it said, relevant sales do not occur after the valuation date. It's basically saying that the regulated framework supports the general approach of not considering post facto evidence in the valuation as of the valuation date. And you're going to see as board decisions in various municipalities. I want to believe that in large that this has been recognized by other boards. I've included the City of Edmonton board decision, which echoes the Court of Queen's bench decision, basically saying that the board was not able to put any weight on a sale that occurred after the valuation date, as it was a post facto sale. Now I know the complainant has introduced two board decisions from Calgary, I believe, recent decisions, 2020 decisions, which demonstrate that boards have considered post facto information. But I want to argue that the boards in these cases really had no choice, and these decisions are very distinguishable from the current situation before this board. So if you read those decisions, in one decision there was no sales in the subject stratification. So the only evidence that was before the board was the sale of the subject, which was after the valuation date. So in that decision, the board was left with no choice. A board has to make decisions based on evidence. If the only evidence presented was information after the valuation date, what choice could the board have? Now that's a very different situation than what we have here today. What we have here today, I've introduced and the complainant's introduced 3 sales within the subject complex, all 3 occurring within the analysis period, the 3-year analysis period. So what we have in the current situation is very distinguishable from that situation, and that board decision should not be directly applied or interpreted as the boards commonly use post facto information all the time, because they certainly do not. The second decision, it was very similar situation, except the only information that was before the board was a post facto listing of the subject property, and that's what they had to rely on. So very similar in both circumstances, but the key takeaway here, Mr. Chairman, members of the board, is that those decisions were rendered by boards who had no other evidence before them. All of the evidence disclosed in those hearings were post facto. And since the boards have to rely on evidence to decide, they had no choice. So obviously we can't be critical of boards that do that. They've got to make a decision based on the evidence presented, but that shouldn't be misinterpreted as boards commonly use sales after the valuation date or market evidence after the valuation date, because it's just not true. And currently in the current situation where there is sufficient market evidence prior to the valuation date, within the analysis year, close to the valuation date, I don't think that we should entertain the idea of now bringing in post facto information when the assessor simply cannot use it in the valuation in the preparation of assessments. With that said, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for your time. I open the floor to questions.
Okay, I'm just going to ask that we can take a quick 2-minute break. If anybody needs to leave other than me, please feel free. But I'll be right back, and thank you for your indulgence in advance. All right, I'm back. Thank you, everybody. I'll just wait for everyone else to come back and turn their cameras back on. All right, everyone. I see everybody is back, so we'll now move on and complained opportunity to ask questions to the respondent.
All right, thank you. You'll have to bear with me. I have a number of questions, but they all have relevance. So I'm gonna, if you can, everyone can go to R1, page 13. Shouldn't say everyone go there because I can't control what you do. Going. So Lance, I see that you prepared the ASR for what you are saying are the most comparable units in the complex. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
I noticed that the subject unit wasn't included in the summary. It was, based on my calculations of the ASR, the result would be 1.27. Would you agree with my calculations? You want to take some time to do that?
Yeah, I think it'd be very close. Yeah, whether you include the two assessments into the parking lots, I think it'd be very close. Yeah.
Yeah. let's take the parking out of it because it's going to be immaterial.
Deal.
So if you make those calculations, and then I see the average based on your evidence, the average is 0.956 ASR. And the unit's ASR would be 1.27. So that's a 33% variance. How do you account for that?
It's quite typical in mass appraisal models. When you do the statistical testing of any mass appraisal model, when we talk about the variance of indicators, we talk about a statistical calculation called the coefficient of dispersion. So it's the absolute average deviation from the median. And so for an assessment model, the assessors actually legislated for example, residential condominiums to be below 15%. So, and that's on average. So that means that honestly, if you have an indicator at 1.3 or 0.7, it's not only common, but it's expected.
Thank you. Do you agree that there is a diminishing value or a principle of diminishing value per square foot as the size of a unit increases?
Yeah, it's the law of diminishing returns is what you're citing. Yep.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. And do you agree that size of a unit is only one factor of many other factors in determining market value?
Of course, yes, I'd agree with that.
Okay, so layout, finishings, the openness of a unit, other intangibles would affect market value of the property?
Well, not intangibles, right? Of course, the assessment is real estate only.
So how many comparables did you use in determining this market value? Was it the 3?
It was the 3, yeah.
Okay, and how many would you normally use? In the ideal situation, would you comparables?
So the correct answer to that is we use them all. So if there was a complex with 120 units and there was 120 sales, we would use 120 sales.
So would it be fair to say that you didn't have sufficient market evidence by you only having 3 to that you should look at other variables?
Well, again, you could, if the assessor felt like there wasn't enough market evidence within the complex itself, the assessor could choose to go outside the complex. However, with residential condominiums, because the units are so homogeneous, like you say, they have a highly similar location, age, quality, amenities, parking. So to me, I would favor the approach of always staying within the complex versus going without. For me, 3 is sufficient in this case, and it was comfortable for us to go forward with the assessment model.
So the three comparables that you used all had ASRs anywhere from 0.89 to 1. Again, if we used a third being the market value determined by the sale of the subject property, if we used a consistent ASR, we would have a valuation or an assessment of about 1.36, would we not?
Sorry, say that again.
So the 3 comparable units that you just mentioned that were sufficient for you to use, they all had ASRs anywhere from 0.88 to 1, with the average being 0.956.
Okay.
And if we used that average ASR and compared it to the sale price of the subject unit, would the assessment value be around 1.36, what I'm saying it should be?
Oh, so you're wanting to apply the median assessment to sales ratio to the sale price to get the assessment?
Correct.
Well, I mean,
that's the resulting calculation?
I'm not going to disagree with the calculation doesn't produce that result, but that's typically not how you prepare property assessments.
Okay, fair enough. In the past, have you ever used information post facto in determining an assessed value?
Not sales data. So again, if you go back to my earlier presentation, I mentioned some of the reasoning or the background for using a set amount or a set parameter dates for the inclusion of sales. And it really goes back to how the assessor is audited, what the assessor has to submit to municipal affairs, how the assessment level is calculated. So again, even if the assessor wanted to use post facto sales, he wouldn't even be able to submit them to the province for the calculation of an assessment level. So no, for the preparation of assessment, for the preparation of ratios, no, post facto sales unfortunately are not included.
Okay. Have you ever used post facto sales to determine if your assessments are fair and reasonable? So between the period of July 1st and December 31st, you mentioned you couldn't use them as data, but have you ever used it to see if your quality, if your assessment models and your statistical models were fair?
Certainly the process doesn't stop for us on July 1st, 2019. As more market transactions come in, we're constantly verifying, updating data, bringing in those sales for the inclusion for next year's valuation models. So we are very aware of what properties are transferring for after the valuation. And of course, when we've prepared valuation models, we're not oblivious to the fact that some transfers after the valuation date may indicate increasing or decreasing trends. But as I said, we're locked down to a set specific time period, so it wouldn't affect the valuation or the preparation of assessments.
Okay, thank you. Going to the specific subject property in the transaction that was entered into in June of 2019, would you consider the buyer of the subject property to be a willing buyer?
Yes.
Would you consider the seller of the subject property to be a willing seller?
Yes.
Would you could agree that the property was on the open market for an adequate amount of time?
Yes.
I guess that way longer than it should have been is arguably. Would you agree that the facts relating to the sale of the subject property meet the definition of market value then?
Yes, of course.
Okay. And isn't market value what you're trying to determine when you're doing an assessment?
Yes.
Why do you believe then the actual sale price is not the best indication of market value in this case?
Yeah, so I explained that in my presentation. So
Okay.
when an assessor prepares assessments, he's legislated under matters relating to assessment and taxation, specifically under Section 5, subsection A and subsection C. Specifically, the assessor has to use mass appraisal, and he has to prepare assessments using typical market conditions or for typical market conditions. So, and the purpose of that is the underlying purpose of that is to make sure that assessments are equitable. So I'm not saying that the sale of the subject property wasn't a fair market transaction, and in fact, it's going to be included in next year's analysis for the 2021 tax year assessments. All I'm saying is when an assessor groups property and employs the mass appraisal technique, what he's doing, he's stratifying similar properties as we've done in the subjects complex. We're using all of the common data, that is the sales data within that complex, over the sale date parameters, that is the 3 years prior to the valuation date. And we're using those sales to develop an assessment model which is applied in mass back to those properties to ensure fairness and equity. The equity part, of course, every property is subject to the assessment model as developed. The fairness part comes within the statistical testing. So when we look at my page 5.7, all of the sales within that 3-year period, when we statistically test our model against the sale prices, the time adjusted sale prices, you can see that the sales would show that the assessment model is within a reasonable range of market value. So you'll also see that the assessments of each sale are different than the sale prices, because we don't set assessments based on the actual sale price. We use all of the sales, we develop typicals, and we apply in mass.
Thank you. But you do agree that what your objective is to determine market value, and market value is a defined term in the Municipal Government Act.
That's correct. Yep.
Okay, and that the sale of the subject property met all the criteria that you would consider met market value in terms of a willing buyer, willing seller in an open market with ample time.
Yep. We'll be using it here for the assessment. Yep.
Awesome. Thank you. I don't have any further questions at this time. Oh, I do actually. It was pointed out a little earlier that the size of the unit seems to be fluctuating. Is there a possibility the size of this unit could actually only be 3,178 square feet?
Well, we can certainly double check. All we'd have to do is pull the plan and check the size. So that doesn't take too long. I can do that. I can do that and send my results to the clerk.
But it's a possibility that it could be 3,178 feet.
Yeah, if the size of the unit is wrong, as per on the registered plan, then obviously that's an easy fix.
Thank you. I have no further questions at this time.
All right, thank you. Don, would you like to go first with board questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I only have two questions. So, Mr. Wayleggy, thank you for your presentation and the evidence you provided. Am I to gather then that you're not concerned about a 1.27 ASR for a particular unit because you look because it's the average that has to be close to one?
It's the median. The reason why I'm not concerned with a 1.27 indicator is the coefficient of dispersion. So the assessor legislatively has to be below 15% COD. So the COD is defined, as I mentioned, as the absolute average deviation from the median. And so that we have to be below 15%. So on average, the indicators have to be about 15% from that median ratio. That means if it's on average, you're going to have indicators that are roughly double of that. So it's quite common when assessor develops an assessment model and tests that assessment model that you see indicators 0.7, 0.75, 1.2, 1.25. Ultimately, the market for similar properties, oftentimes the sale prices within it will fluctuate. And again, the assessor's job is to prepare a mass appraisal model, and we want to reflect the typical market conditions. So we're trying to be in the middle of that range.
Okay, thank you. That's a very good explanation. So I guess what I'm trying to reconcile here is, and I think that this is the key issue. I mean, if there's agreement that the sale of the subject property meets the requirements of market value, and the assessment is quite different than that, what's your explanation, or what's your rationale to be able to reconcile those two, that disparity?
Yeah, it's not uncommon to have sale indicators that are that have a bit of a variance from the assessment, and it's, as I mentioned previously, it's not only common that you see this, it's expected, right? Because again, when we're dealing with variance and we're statistically testing for coefficient of dispersion, when you have 15%, 10 to 15%, you're going to have indicators that are above and indicators below, right, in that 0.7 to the 1.2, 1.3. I think what you could probably do in this circumstance is hypothetically, if we did want to include the subject's sale into the calculation of the median assessment to sales ratio. So if we slipped in the sale of the subject property at an assessment to sale ratio of 1.27, and then we redid the average and the median assessment to sales ratio, all it does is pull the stats up a bit to right about 0.99 or 1.00. So even with the inclusion of the subject's property, when we look at this from a mass appraisal point of view, the assessments are still within the indicated market value of all of those sales. But you have to look at them as a group, right?
Yeah.
Not as each one.
Yeah, understood. My question was more to not the impact on the overall ASR, but rather just looking specifically at the subject property and the market value, or the value. You indicated that you agreed that it meets market value, the definition of market value, and yet you're not concerned about the assessment being a lot higher because you're applying typical market value, I think is the term that you used. How can you speak to the fact that those are so different? How do you rationalize that and determine
Sure.
it's
So
yeah.
why does it happen is essentially what you're saying. Why do we have an indicator at 0.7 and why would there be an indicator at 1.3, for example? Is that the question?
Well, it's just that we have something here that was obviously sold for 1.36 and it's assessed much higher. I'm assuming the math is correct that it's a 1.27. So obviously there's a disparity there. And no time adjustment would be needed to that sale. So I mean, in my mind, the rationale would be, well, obviously that sale was grossly undervalued. However, if in fact it's met all of the conditions or all of the elements of the definition of market value, that would seem to suggest that anything in market value couldn't be undervalued. So how do you reconcile the difference?
Yeah. I think I know what you're trying to ask, and again, I think I've tried to answer the question in that, of course, we're trying to meet the middle, right? We're trying to be in that mid range, and in doing so, you're going to have indicators that on an individual basis are going to be on the high ends. So, for example, when you have indicators at 0.7, it would indicate maybe somebody had gotten a good deal, for example. Right? Maybe, or maybe overpaid, right? Paid too much money for the property in comparison to what the typical range would suggest. So it's in my mind, it could be a lot of things about why this happens, but ultimately the assessor, when he employs mass appraisal, those are very common. Those are very common. Yes, you see those things and you immediately think, well, there must be something wrong here. There must be something wrong. It could be timing. It could be a bunch of different variables. But ultimately, they do happen, and they do happen commonly in not only valuation models that we see in the subject, but other valuation models of single-family properties or non-residential properties. Oftentimes, you're going to get these indicators. So, for me, I'm not fazed when I see some of these because it is quite common for a mass appraiser. So when a mass appraiser looks at that, it's easier for me to see that and be okay with that because we deal with that situation not only on an annual basis, but I've been preparing assessments for 16 years, and that happens quite a lot. But I will say the majority of indicators are always going to be reflecting in the middle range, and some of these outlying properties, whether high or low, are not. They're not. There's not a lot of them, high or low, but they do occur. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah. Would it be fair to say that? Because I'm just trying to find, what's the rationalization that market value as to be determined for assessment purposes, in order to be equitable, is not necessarily equal to the sales price of one unit, even if it meets the definition of market value.
That's right.
Right. Okay.
That's right. Oftentimes you'll hear the phrase that one sale doesn't create a market, and generally that's very true. Yeah, that's very true.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Alternatively, I should say, if we had a sale, let's say at 2 million, would the assessor come along and then increase all of the assessments to meet that one sale? No, right? It would be one indicator in a group of properties, right? And that's really the strength of a mass appraisal model, is that it's not affected by one or two outlying sales one way or the other, because you're always trying to value the group as a whole and reflect the typical.
Okay, so just on that then, I mean, next year for the appraisal, if there's just these 3 sales, and I think they'll also be within the 3-year period, plus this other 4th one that's obviously lower, obviously that will have a downward pressure on assessments when you take a look at its impact on the whole, just like a higher one would have an upward pressure.
Absolutely. So hypothetically, we add this one in, and maybe there's 1 or 2 more that would indicate a decreasing trend in market value. Then the assessment model typically would follow that trend. Yeah.
Great. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I have a couple of questions. So one is more specific, and it relates on page 10 of your evidence, specifically in relation to roll number 19011. So this is the unit I believe you indicated as being the most comparable. So it's
That's right.
And so it had a sales price 1.663 million, a time adjusted sales price 1.674500. And then we go over to table 5.7 on page 13. And I'm just interested in the time adjusted sales price and the assessment, and just whether you had any comments on the differential in that one. Obviously, this is the most similar unit in terms of unit size, and then also the same level, although different building.
Yeah, very good point. Very good point. It's good to point out the fact that the most comparable sale for the subject property in Unit 303, 150 Stone Creek, sold for the 1.63 million. It is adjacent. Essentially, it's like a little bit smaller, but the plan is very similar. And again, when we include that sale with the other 2, and we create the valuation model, we apply that back. Ultimately, the assessment of that particular property, because it is lower or smaller than the subject's assessment, it is going to be assessed lower, right? Because the size is a little bit lower. And when we compare the adjusted price to the assessment, of course, our ratio for that particular indicator comes in at 0.951. So to me, I think that's really good to point that out, that the best indicator there assessed slightly lower than the subject because it's smaller, and the sale price, or the time sale price, would be slightly higher than the assessment.
Okay. My second question is just on your table 5.8 and looking at the rates per square foot. And I think we sort of already covered the ground that if the unit is smaller, we'd probably expect to see a slightly higher rate per square foot, and lower, a larger unit, a lower rate per square foot. I just wondered if you could comment, there's that band of properties, the last 4. So the smallest one is 1690 square feet and the largest one is 3,000 square feet. They all have the same assessed value per square foot.
Yeah, I think ultimately the subject complex has really suffered from a lack of market data, such that obviously with more sales in the complex, it would be clear as to what the market is indicating or would pay for on a price per square foot basis, some of the smaller units versus the larger units. So I'm hoping in the future there's more market data within the complex such that the assessment model could be tightened up a little bit with that respect. But I do see what you're saying. And I chalk that up to essentially just not having a lot of evidence within the subject complex, unfortunately.
Okay, those are the two questions I had. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the parking stalls at assessment of $10,000, can you confirm then that those are taxed separately?
That's correct. Yep.
And you have no issue with that $10,000 valuation?
Nope.
Okay. And can you confirm, do all of these units in these two buildings, 150 and 140 Stone Creek Road, do they all have the same municipal zoning?
I believe they do. Yes. Yep.
Or are they residential or tourist, do you know?
Residential.
They're all residential. Thank you. So just wanted to drill down a little bit about this post facto sale. Maybe you can agree with me that there's really kind of three dates when somebody buys a property. There's the conditional sale date where you've agreed on all prices and terms and sort of set the price. And then there's the second date where the parties waive conditions. So they've done their due diligence and have agreed on to move forward. And then the third date is actually the date the land transfers. Is that fair?
That's fair. Yep.
Okay. And so when I looked at the evidence, it was really kind of that middle date that it became unconditional. That was July 5th. And that's your rationale for not including it as it then becomes post facto?
Very, very close. Actually, if you turn to my page, if you turn to my page 43 in R1. So the date that, so the date that the assessor uses is the transfer date. And that's not only in the town of Canmore, that's for all municipalities in Alberta. Of course, going back to the reasoning on essentially submitting your assessments to the province, being audited, being equalized. So everything is standardized in the province of Alberta. So the assessor always uses the transfer date. So as you see on the transfer documents here, the subject property transferred July 28th. And that would be the reason why.
Okay, fair enough. And when you quoted the decisions from some of our learned courts, was there anything in those decisions that said, using the land transfer date versus, the date that the market value is actually set?
I believe in the Court of Queen's Bench decision. Now, I just provided an excerpt, but I believe in the Court of Queen's Bench decision, they referenced the transfer date for assessment purposes. But I don't believe I have that in my document submission.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. And so then if in fact these buyers and sellers had gotten together a little bit earlier and the transfer date was June 28th instead of July 28th, would you have included this in your analysis, this sale?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Yeah, if the sale was before July 1st, then it would have been included. Yeah. Okay.
I just wanted to poke a little bit more about the RMS standard and the size of the units. So if we go back perhaps to the E2, and that was on page 4. When you go look to MLS type databases, I'm sure you'll see they have things like, the square feet above ground, the registered size, etc. what is the size statistic that you would typically rely on?
The size on the registered plan.
So that would be the condominium registered plan.
That's correct. Yeah.
And that would be consistent for all of your assessments?
Yes, except in the case where I've seen some very rare condominium plans where they've, I don't want to say accidentally, but they've included in the square footage of the parking stall as well. So in those particular unique circumstances, we would go and exclude that area from the parking stall.
Okay, and if I can maybe just understand, that's not something that would change from year to year. Presumably, you would have a database of all of the condominiums in Canmore, and when new ones come along, somebody inputs the registered size, and then that number kind of stays in your model until somebody decides that there's an error or an expansion.
Yeah, it's not an annual process to double check condo unit sizes. Typically, when the plan is registered, the assessor would put in document the area, and that stays with the unit going forward. Now, that's not to say that there's not the occasional error with data entry or otherwise.
Fair enough. And can I take you to R1, page 10, 5.5, paragraph 5.5. So the first comparable there, I think, as you mentioned, is a very comparable unit, similar size, just in the other building. So presumably when that buyer and seller got together, a month prior, 2 months prior, they came to a sale price of 1.663 million. Don't you think it's reasonable that that same buyer also looked at the subject property?
Could have very well, yep.
Okay, and so using it as a comparable, doesn't it give you some pause for thought that these two units, even though they were purchased a month apart, 2 months apart, sold for whatever, $260,000 difference, that there might have been some other factors? And
yeah, it certainly raises a question mark. I think what's really striking for me is the similarity of the two units, right? They're basically side by side. Obviously, except for being essentially a building over. The layout plans are virtually identical. Essentially, this sale is just a little bit smaller. I've argued that the views with respect to the location are very similar. Age, quality of construction is very similar. Obviously, it's in the same complex, so it's subject to similar amenities. To me, if we ignored the sale prices of these two units, I would certainly consider them both highly similar.
Okay, and just my last question, if we go to page 3 of R1. The little green pin that you have there, that isn't the subject unit, is it?
It's sort of the general location of the subject unit, so it's maybe a little bit more left than that.
So that the pin is in building 140?
That's correct.
And so the other unit is in 150, and it would be on this picture, sort of on the right-hand side?
Be on the left-hand side of that, left of that pin, left of the green pin.
The other right-hand, yeah, the left-hand side. And so then the subject unit would have views to the south and west, and the comparable that would have views to the north. Have I got that right, or is it the other way around?
I think you're correct, yeah. Or the north with the subject, and yeah, I think you're correct.
Okay. And so did you think that perhaps that was part of the significant difference in sort of the sale price, is that the unit that was in the southwest corner and the views across the valley, et cetera, that might account for some of that market value difference as opposed to, looking north into the trees?
Well, certainly when you talk about mass appraisal and the limited sales data that you have, certainly one could make that assertion just based on the two sales. But again, I would argue that something like that, to be 100% confident, you certainly need a little bit more market data. Maybe if you had some sales of the units on the second floor to compare, or then the first floor, or but two sales, it's easy to make that assertion when there's only two indicators. But for me, I would be very cautious in something like that.
Okay. Thank you very much. Those are my questions. Mr. Staskowski, do you have any rebuttal evidence you'd like to put forward?
You betcha. Someone's knocking at the door. Someone should let somebody in.
Yeah, that's, sorry, I've got a worker showing up here. I'm going to mute my mic.
That's okay. I hear you knocking, but you can't come in. That's bad singing. I apologize. So some comments in rebuttal to the respondents' disclosure, and some of the comments came up in questioning as well. But one thing that really hit home is, in the questioning, the respondent said there was a lack of market data in the complex and lack of sufficient evidence. And earlier, the respondent also said when there's a lack of sufficient evidence, you could use post facto. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, Lance, but I believe that's what you said, and that's what my notes say, so it must be right. And then the justice's responses were the same thing, is that when there's a lack of market evidence, you can use post facto transactions to determine market value. And I want to emphasize what we're trying to determine here is market value. So we have all these hypothetical models and the mass appraisal models, but we're trying to determine market value. And market value, I think.
Sorry, Todd, I'm just going to interrupt you.
Yep.
Just trying to follow the process here. I'm really asking if you have any rebuttal evidence. I will give you an opportunity to make your arguments and submissions.
Okay, I apologize.
No need to apologize.
Maybe I was getting to my point. So my next one's here. If they're not evidence, you let me know. You can cut me off and I'll bring it back later. So, Mr. Chair, you mentioned this in your questioning. So I'm going to talk about the sale of Unit 303, 150 Stone Creek Road, comparable one. And the respondent says that that's a very highly similar unit. So I want to highlight the reality that the market shows that the value of the subject unit is nowhere close to the 1.756, because both units were on market at the same time. The list price of the units were substantially different. Subject unit was listed for 1.498 million. Comparable unit was listed for 1.698. And as you mentioned, the buyer of comparable one most likely viewed both units, but they chose to pay 1.663 for comparable one. Even though the subject unit, even if it played list price, could have been purchased for 1.498, $200,000 less. So this to me is market evidence. Again, we're going back to market of the value of the subject unit is not 1.756. I also want to, next point relating to evidence is that the market transaction is close to July 1st, 2019. And I suggest that market transactions are acceptable for assessor and the assessment review board when determining market value. So Government of Alberta's document, page 15 of C3. The paragraph near the top that starts with the words look for says look for sales close to July 1st, 2019. It doesn't say look for sales prior to July 1st, 2019, close to. Paragraph 23 of page 13 of C4. I'll let everybody get there.
So what was the page number again, please?
Page 13. Paragraph 23. So this is a written decision of the Calgary Assessment Review Board. And it states that post facto evidence was relied upon to determine the best indicator of the value of the assessment. So I believe that the respondent has not provided anything in law. So in-law evidence, there's been no in-law evidence that restricts the assessment review boards to use post facto evidence in determining the market value of the property. It's my understanding as well that in the assessment review boards has a lot of discretion of what they can use for evidence. You can use post facto evidence if you want to. And the respondent, he cited in page 21 of R1. Respondent really wanted to hit home about the beta management matter, where they said the post facto evidence could not be used. And I can't disagree with what's in writing, but I believe it's not relevant. Because if you look at the context and the facts relating to that beta management matter, you're going to find out why. The facts are quite different in three distinct ways. One, the post facto transaction in that case was not on the market. It wasn't on the open market, not at all. The post facto transaction that occurred in that case was not between two arm's length parties. And the transaction was 6 months after the July 1st period. So it was not even in that intervening period between July 1st and December 31st. It was after that. So those three things were quite important, quite distinct. So yeah, the justice said, well, you can't use that, the post facto transaction. I'm going to assert that the facts and the evidence that's been submitted that's in front of you is that the subject property was on the open market. The buyer and seller were clearly at arm's length. The respondent mentioned he agreed with that. And the transaction was entered into prior to July 1st, meaning what's the transaction? Is the transaction that really occurred, to me, that was just prior to July 1st. Closing, yes, it happened in July 28th. But when did the seller and the buyer make the decision to enter into that transaction? In June of 2019. There was diligence period that occurred after that time period to get comfort of the decision that was made. Yeah, that was the condition removal date, but when was the actual transaction entered into? It was in June. To me, that's evidence that, and if you need me to cite the...
Mr. Stuskowski, I'm going to interrupt you again.
Yeah.
I'm really looking for any rebuttal evidence you had. I heard some rebuttal evidence around the beta management case.
Okay.
I'll give you ample time to make your submissions and your argument.
Okay.
Do you have any more rebuttal evidence you'd like for us to consider?
Sorry, I'm having a hard time determining between what's evidence and what's an argument. But if it's in
So,
is it not evidence?
Sorry, maybe I can just help a little bit. If you have any other evidence that things like what was in the beta management case, I appreciate that. That gives us some insights, and maybe we'll go look at that case a little bit more. So anything like that, I would consider to be evidence. But and then your argument is, why you feel your position is correct.
Okay. Thank you again. Stop me if I need to move that to a different section. The respondent talked about the appraisal was inadequate, the appraisal that was put in by a qualified appraiser, and he questioned the results of it. And I would suggest that the appraiser, being a third party, had no vested interest in the outcome. The appraiser did what the appraiser thought was important and came up with the value that was in the appraisal. And there's evidence that was submitted to respond to the respondent's quote criticism of the appraisal, and that's in the market evidence in C3. So I think it supports the market value. All right. Well, I'm going to defer everything else to my closing arguments. How's that?
Great, thank you very much. Respondent, any questions on the rebuttal evidence?
Yeah, sure. So just a quick comment. Yeah, no, I mean, no disrespect to the appraiser, and you know, she's a professional and I'm a professional, and you know, sometimes professionals disagree on certain things, and so I just want to clarify that I have no criticism of what she did. I know she's under her job's tough, same as everybody else. I just disagreed with some of the decisions with respect to the selection of comparables, and I went into a bit of depth as to why I would not have selected those comparables, but certainly I respect her opinion, and I know she's a very good appraiser and certainly is well known in the community, and I would certainly not mean any disrespect to her or her credentials or her qualifications. So just a matter of difference of opinion, and certainly that's what I was seeking to do there by highlighting some of my opinions there. With respect to a lack of evidence in the subject complex, I just want to clarify. I don't feel that there was a lack of evidence to develop a valuation model in the subject complex. I feel that there's a lack of evidence to establish some of the adjustments that were discussed in the subject complex. So, for example, we had a little bit of discussion on a view between comparable number 1 and the subject property. So just for the boards, just a quick note, I don't think that there is a lack of evidence, just specifically speaking to some of the adjustments that maybe need a little bit more market evidence before we can be comfortable or confident adding or subtracting value within the assessment model. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman and members of the board, for allowing me to present here today. You know, it's a very tough decision, I will say this, that this type of scenario in the 16 years that I've been an assessor has rarely come about. Typically, when a property transfers post facto, you know, it could be higher than the assessment, could be lower than the assessment, but it's typically within a reasonable range that this circumstance doesn't happen. So I will say this is a very unique circumstance, and I understand that it's going to be a very difficult decision for the board. Really, I really want to emphasize some of the processes that the assessor has to comply with throughout the valuation or preparation.
I'm going to ask you again just to limit your comments on the rebuttal evidence. I will give you a chance to make your summation arguments. It feels like that's where you're heading.
I thought this was a summation argument. My apologies.
No. So do you have any comments on the rebuttal evidence that
like Mr. Stakowski, I'll reserve my summary for later.
Okay.
But just remember the first half of it so I don't have to repeat myself.
Okay, well, we definitely heard all the comments and we will take them into consideration, and please don't feel that you need to repeat them. So I will now move into our arguments and summation. For the complaint, do you have any additional summations you'd like to make for us?
I thought the complainant had the last word.
You do get the last word. The process that I outlined is we're going to allow you to make an argument and summation. Then we'll allow the respondent to do the same, and then you get the last word of rebuttal.
My last word of rebuttal, can I say anything?
Within reason.
All right, I just don't want to be out of line, out of process.
Well, I think the last word is intended to be rebuttal. So it's intended that if the respondent says something, you can respond to it. We definitely don't need to hear your whole argument again, and we don't want to hear new arguments.
You don't want to hear more than you have to. Okay. So can I proceed?
Please go ahead.
Okay. So in summary, I'm going to refer back to the hearing of this morning as well. This is relating to the de facto argument. And I know, Mr. Chair, you weren't at that meeting, but the chair of that meeting, her eyebrows raised, and she really questioned the argument that de facto evidence couldn't be used. And I just want to bring that up. So I urge the board to consider all the market evidence in addition to the other arguments that I have presented in determining market value. And to me, it's not a hard decision to make. I think you have a very easy decision to make here. I think we've proved that market value was determined. I think market value was determined by that willing buyer and the willing seller that entered into that transaction. And as I was mentioning earlier, that transaction, I believe, was entered into in June of 2019. So in the alternate that you can't use de facto evidence of the closing, I believe that the evidence relating to that's admissible evidence is the evidence that was put forward in C2, I believe, that the real estate transaction was entered into in June of 2019. That's when everybody made the decision. That's how much I'm going to pay for it. They did some confirmatory diligence after the fact that didn't relate to their decision of how much you're going to pay for the property, but more is, was the condo docs fine? Was there enough in the reserve fund study, those type of other items? But the decision that was made in June of 2019 is I'm going to pay X amount of dollars. Going back to the market value, the definition of market value, I believe that was met. I believe there was sufficient evidence provided to illustrate the respondent's assessed value is incorrect and the complainant's value is correct. And I believe you need to ask the question is what valuation is more reasonable? A hypothetical estimate of value or a true value based on two arm's length transactions that occurred right around July 1st, 2019. And I assert that it's 1.360. And I believe I wasn't able to say this earlier, so I'll say it now. When those two transactions occurred relating to unit 303-150 and the subject unit, that the buyer decided, even though they could have purchased the unit for $200,000 left, even if they paid list price, they chose not to purchase that unit. So there's something fundamentally, for whatever reason, the market, not my idea or my thoughts, but the market said that that value of that property is $1,360,000. There was that other unit that closed in October of 18. That unit and the subject unit were on for sale at the same time as well, going back to, I believe, page 4 of C2. So there was a couple times when buyers could have purchased that unit, but they chose not to. Market value determined that unit was worth $1,360,000. I'm just going to go over some of my notes here to see if I missed anything. Oh, I'm good. I'm good to go. It's all yours, Lance.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please continue on with your summation and your argument.
With my rant? Sure. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Thank you, Mr. Stikowski. It's been interesting over the last number of months, but you've been very easy to work with, and you've been very nice and very polite, and so I thank you for that and your presentation here today. I think really what I would like to leave in my closing arguments to the board is really two things, and the first with respect to post facto information, and that comes on my page. It would be on my section 6.2, so that would be page 21. And so what I want to turn the board's attention to there is the definitive language. The definitive language in the decision doesn't leave room for situations or circumstances. The decision was written as such. Relevant sales do not occur after the valuation date. Very, very definitive, very matter of fact. And we've had a lot of discussion here today about post facto in, post facto out, the subject sale. Mr. Chairman, this might even be a bit of a moot point, because even if we include, we had a little bit of discussion around it, but even if we include that, now of course the assessor can't, but even if the board wants to bring that sale into the set of three and use that sale to see if overall the assessments are within a reasonable range of market value with respect to median assessment to sales ratios and CODs. I think that you'll find that even bringing that sale in and running the stats on the floor, you're still going to find an assessment model that is within the quality standards set out in the matters relating to assessment and taxation regulation. So ultimately, we may be arguing something that, in my opinion, might just be a moot point, because even if it was brought in, you're still looking at a quality of assessment that meets the quality standards. So I think I'll leave those 2 points with you, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. Again, I thank you for your time. Thank you for your consideration. Thank you to Mr. Stakowski. Be safe and be well.
Okay, thank you. I just need to take another 10-second break. Please bear with me. My apologies, everyone. Apparently, hearings run on time, but contractors do not. Okay. Back to you, complainant, last word, please. Any rebuttal comments?
Just two, I guess. One is, I don't think it is a moot point. I think what we're trying to determine market value, and market value has been determined by definition. We've gone over that a few times, and other justices have, I guess, had different opinions that post facto evidence is allowable. And lastly, I guess I want to thank Lance for his assistance right from the get-go, from the first time I contacted him, and whenever that was, earlier this year. So I thank Lance as well, and I thanks the board for all their time with this hearing and other ones as well.
Great, well, much appreciate that. So I'd like to thank everyone for their cooperation, their presentations, and the professionalism that everyone has shown. That's greatly appreciated. So at this time, I just want to ask the parties and have them confirm that they felt that they've been heard today and they've received a fair and impartial hearing. First for the complainant.
Yes, I have. Thank you.
Okay, and for the respondent?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you.
You're welcome. So I'll now declare that the hearing is closed. No further evidence or submissions may be received by the board. The Municipal Government Act requires a written decision within 30 days and gives the clerk an additional 7 days to issue the decision. We will make every effort to meet or beat those requirements, and the clerk will forward our decision at our earliest opportunity. So with that, I'd like to close the hearing. And again, thank you everybody for your participation. So for those respondent, complainant, if you could just please log off of Zoom.